Well, good morning. It's a wet morning and nice and cool. In a tent, of all things. Yes. Oh, good. We are in Joshua chapter 11 this morning. We're looking at the second half of the chapter, verses 16 to 23. Just to orient you a bit, assuming I can get my slide to come up, which it may just take a bit here. Matt, do you want to click on my second slide? Maybe that'll help. Thank you. We are generally in the section on the subjugation of the land, and more specifically, chapter 11 talks about the subjugation of the northern part of the land. If you take the center to be the central Gibeon, Benjamin Plateau, Ai, Bethel, Jericho's not on the plateau, but it's about that same latitude. And this section that we're looking at today specifically recounts, they've had the battle, so it's going to recount the areas that they have taken, and we'll look at those on the map, and you also have that on your handout coming around. And then a fascinating little section at the end of the chapter about the Anakim, who I think it's pretty clear when you put enough text together, they are very tall men. I don't know if you want to refer to them as giants or something like that, but that'll be at the end of this section. Next week, my intent is to cover the entirety of chapter 12. Chapter 12 also does something of a review of the land conquered, and then it goes through and lists kings of cities that were conquered one by one. There's 31 of them altogether. And so we'll look at that. And a fair bit of that's going to be review, stuff you've already heard, and I don't want to bore you with it. So I plan to have a little extra time at the end to address the question next week of the morality of the conquest. Sometimes we get a little uneasy with all this death and destruction, and how do we justify that from an ethical standpoint? I don't know that any of you have a problem with it, but it's a question that gets asked, and so I want to address that. I think there are some really interesting things to add in to that that help us understand it. So we'll look at that next week when we look at chapter 12. Okay. Boy, I may just have to restart this. If you will be so kind as to give me a moment. Try reconnecting once again. Yay! Something worked. Don't computer guys always say that? Have you tried shutting it down? Basically. Usually it works. That's right. And it did. Okay. So Joshua chapter 11, beginning with verse 16, and I just want to step through these with you kind of one at a time. So Joshua took all that land, and then the first thing he names is the hill country. And so on our map, that is right in the center of what would become the tribe of Judah. It's probably stretching up a little bit into the tribe of Benjamin as well. It's the central ridge. It's the southern portion of this, and the reason we know that is because later on he's going to refer to the hill country of Israel. So that would be the northern section. The hill country and all the Negev. The Negev is down to the south. It's a kind of a valley, flat valley type area that's roughly shaped like a circle 8. It doesn't actually look like an 8, but it has a little bit of a pinched section in the middle, right where the city of Beersheba is. Well, you can see Beersheba, and I have moved my label down a little bit so that I can get in the next one, which is all that land of Goshen. And Goshen, we think, it was referenced earlier in this account when they took the south. It's between the Negev and the hill country. There is another Goshen that's mentioned in the book of Genesis, which is down in Egypt. There's a land of Goshen in Egypt. This is not the same one. So, probably the one down in Egypt is better known if you know the book of Genesis and the stories of Abraham and Jacob and Joseph, and they lived down there, the Israelites did, but this is a different Goshen. I see that inquiring hand. Yes. Yeah. No, you would be surprised at the number of names that are used for multiple places. Another one that comes to mind right away is Gilgal. There's a Gilgal down by Jericho, and reading through the Elisha and Elijah story right at the end of Elijah's life, he goes from Gilgal to Bethel to Jericho and then crosses the Jordan. Clearly he's coming from another Gilgal. But there are a whole variety of those, so good enough. This one, I believe, is also mentioned later on when this Goshen, when the allotment is given to Judah and or Simeon. So we have another reference to a Goshen in this place. But I can't be much more specific than that. Okay, land of Goshen, the lowland. And so we're going to just kind of take that as a generic reference to sometimes the foothills are separated out from the coastal plain, but there's not a differentiation given here, and clearly they took the whole thing. So the lowland off to the west of the hill country. The hill country, all the Negev, all that land of Goshen. The lowland, the Arabah. The Arabah is the Jordan Rift Valley. You could probably extend this a little ways even further north. It definitely covers the area between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, and much further south. Often it goes, the way it's described, goes the entire way down to the Red Sea, the city of Eilat. So you're not even seeing the entire thing here, although this is probably the area that Joshua is mentioning here. But it's the Jordan, the valley of the Jordan River, Sea of Galilee, Dead Sea, and even further south. Does Arabah, is that a name that you know? It's not terribly common in the Old Testament, but it does occur a number of times. This is not the only place. And sometimes we get reference to the valley of the Jordan River, that kind of thing. A different way of saying it. Okay. Question? The name means something like the Southland. When it's used geographically, it seems to refer to this valley region. It's the furthest south that you can go and still have semi-arable land where you can plant wheat or a grain crop. Once you move south of the Negev, it's just desert, unless you have an oasis or something. So in some contexts it could refer more to just a general southern region, but when it's used geographically, and I think that's the intent here, it's an identifiable geographical region. So, good question. But it also distracted me. Oh yes, toward the end of verse 16, the hill country of Israel. So that's the equivalent of the hill country, except it's in the north. And I have extended that all the way up into Galilee based on the fact that that's area that Joshua took, as described earlier in the chapter. The hill country of Israel, and finally the lowland, the lowland of Israel. Now the area I've got highlighted there, the mountains of the Mount Carmel range run right through the middle of that, and I understand that's not lowland. But the area around the coastal city of Dor and further north, and they took essentially up to the city of Tyre. So there's a lot of coastal region in there. And then in verse 17, from Mount Halak that rises toward Seir, even as far as Baal Gad, in the valley of Lebanon at the foot of Mount Hermon. So we have two extremities here, and those I've highlighted on the map for you in red. Mount Halak is not too far. That's not going to be helpful to you. It's further south than the Negev. It's dry desert country. With sufficient planning, you can take a caravan through there and make it if you plan for water. But other than that, there's nothing to do down there. So it's the extreme south in that region, unless you go further, like to an oasis like Kadesh Barnea, which is actually off the map here to the south. But there's just a little outpost there. Further to the north, Baal Gad, which is apparently a little further north even than Dan. And of course, we have these helpful things in the valley of Lebanon at the foot of Mount Hermon. You know how good your geography is. But Mount Hermon is up here. The valley of Lebanon runs clear up into Lebanon. And so I don't think we can actually put our finger on this site, but it's quite clear the region where it's at. Do you know what is perhaps the most common set of cities that are used to describe the entire land? Yes, Dan to Beersheba. All Israel from Dan to Beersheba. That appears multiple times in the Old Testament, because those are kind of two extreme, the far ends in the south and the north. And here's Beersheba, and here's Dan. So this description here in Joshua is kind of interesting, because he didn't say from Dan to Beersheba. He said from Mount Halak to Baal Gad, which is even further in extent than the more typical Dan to Beersheba. So I think he's trying to tell us we took it all. There was no one who stood before us successfully. Let's see. Somebody asked me, and I don't know if I made a promise, but I said, it'd be interesting to put a map of Israel over the state of Nebraska just for size. And so that's what this is, to give you a little bit of perspective on the size comparison. I think often in our minds, Israel becomes this very large country, and it's not that large. I mean, if you tried to traverse this on foot or on horseback, it would take you a while. It's not a 10-mile journey, but it's maybe a fifth? I forget exactly what number I put on there. Less than that. Okay, so my map there, the land area you're looking at is probably about a fifth of the size of Nebraska, but there's extra on the edges and corners and stuff. And if you actually map out the square miles that Joshua claims to have taken here and compare that to the square miles of the state of Nebraska, it's closer to 11% of what we have within our state.
Would the Canaanites have used terms like the hill country and lowlands before the conquest? Like, was that how those regions were referred to?
Boy, I don't think I can answer that question, Armin. We also have these, I'm going to call them enigmatic statements about people groups. The Perizzites and the Hivites and the Amorites and the Jebusites. There's a few, Jebusites, Jebus, the city of Jebus, Jerusalem. There are people that live there. Hivites, there's not a city called Hiv. Amorites, I mean, they're spread all over. So I don't know. Did they associate them more with a place and refer to them that way? I can't answer that question. These are geographical descriptions. The hill country, the lowlands, the Negev, today you can go and, you could almost draw a line where many of these places go. They're a little bit general in some areas, but
That map overlay there, we're also studying the second coming, what's all promised to Israel?
what all is promised to Israel?
Sometimes I hear to the river Euphrates.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That would extend it a lot.
Yeah, from the river Euphrates.
Joshua didn't conquer all that.
No, he didn't. Solomon had control. That's hard to say. Have we conquered Puerto Rico? We control it. They get tax dollars from us. That's kind of like what some of this was for Solomon. He controlled it. He took in revenue from them. He protected them. But they weren't Israelite per se. I'm thinking north of the Sea of Galilee up into what would be today Lebanon and parts of Syria. But yeah, we have descriptions. The descriptions vary. They're not all identical. But we have some that say, all the way from the Euphrates down to the brook of Egypt. And this map is small. You're almost looking at the brook of Egypt down here. But the Euphrates would be clear up here. So yeah, that's a much larger area than what Joshua conquered here, ultimately. But that said, I don't think it was God's intention that he take more than this at this time. Because to be honest with you, they had trouble populating this much at this time. And they would not have had a way, short of, mercenary forces hired from some other place or something. They wouldn't have had a way to control double this area. They didn't have enough people to populate it. And they struggled even here. We'll get to some of that later on. But yeah, it's a great question. Verse 18, Joshua waged war a long time with all these kings. That could be just about a throwaway sentence, right? He doesn't dwell on that, like how many years was it, Joshua? He doesn't give us much information. What's a long time? But it's easy to get in our heads that, within a month they had taken everything and then that was it. The conquest was over. And this verse alerts us to the fact that that's not actually how it worked. This was an ongoing thing, and in fact, they did not take every place within the land. I wanted to actually give you a verse here out of the next book, Judges. These are the nations which the Lord left to test Israel by them, that is, all the Israelites who had not experienced any of the wars of Canaan, only in order that the generations of the sons of Israel might be taught war, those who had not experienced it formerly. These nations are, that the Lord left, that the Israelites did not conquer, the 5 lords of the Philistines, and all the Canaanites, and the Sidonians, and the Hivites who lived in Mount Lebanon, from Baal Hermon as far as Lebo Hamath. They were for testing Israel to find out if they would obey the commandments of the Lord, which he had commanded their fathers through Moses. We have other passages too that tell us specifically these are the areas the Israelites did not conquer. So it's a mixed bag. We have some general statements that, like what we just went through here, he took all this territory, but realize there are pockets of resistance in here too, and some of them last for centuries. And I just think this is an interesting one. God wanted to leave some of them in order to test the sons of Israel and to teach them war, which is an interesting thing. Yeah, that's true. There were some that were left because the Israelites simply were disobedient. Well, the Gibeonites, right in the heart of the country, right? Should not have been there, but were there because of their disobedience. Speaking of Gibeon, verse 19, there was not a city which made peace with the sons of Israel except the Hivites living in Gibeon. They took them all in battle. And I think the critical thing there is that Israel was not making peace. It's not that every single city from the river Euphrates to the brook of Egypt was decimated and everyone annihilated. Rather, they didn't make peace with anybody. The exception is the Gibeonites. Those they made peace with. But anybody else that they ran into or that came up against them, they wiped them out. They did not make peace treaties with people, which was a good thing, at least during Joshua's day, under the command of Joshua. Verse 20, Joshua 11 and verse 20. For it was of the Lord to harden their hearts to meet Israel in battle in order that he might utterly destroy them, that they might receive no mercy, but that he might destroy them just as the Lord had commanded Moses. Does that remind you of anybody, anything, any other event? Pharaoh, right? Kind of a classic. God hardened his heart. And you know why. I mean, if Pharaoh had just said, okay, you can let him go, where's the glory for God in that? He wanted to bring out his people in a magnificent way, and that required resistance on the part of Pharaoh, and so God hardened his heart. And they came out in a magnificent way. It was really, and here we have a slightly different reason. It's because God wanted these people destroyed. And we'll talk more about that next week. But God did not want them at this point to receive mercy. He wanted them destroyed. I just want to give you two statements here regarding the question of why God objected to peace treaties with the Canaanites or the other people living here. The first one I would suggest is that the Canaanites were wicked and deserved punishment. this little section in Leviticus, don't defile yourselves by any of these things, for by all these the nations which I am casting out before you have become defiled. For the land has become defiled. Therefore I have brought its punishment upon it. So the land has spewed out its inhabitants. Interesting description, right? These people have become so evil that the land itself is vomiting them up. We never really get a description of how evil these people were or what it is that they were guilty of doing. But we hear again and again and again from God, their sin has reached my limit, and I'm done with them, and they are to be destroyed. And this is one of those passages. A second reason here, God feared that the Canaanites would contaminate his people. He said in Exodus 23, "You shall make no covenant with them or with their gods. They shall not live in your land, because they will make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely become a snare to you." God didn't want that to happen. Unfortunately, his fear proved to be well-founded because that did happen in more cases than we like to admit. In fact, it's almost the exception when it didn't happen. I mean, you think of a guy like Gideon, he's kind of secretly worshiping the true God, and his family and his father are worshiping false gods, Canaanite gods. He's one example out of dozens and dozens and dozens. So there, I think, are at least a couple of good reasons why it is God did not want them to make covenants, peace treaties with the locals. They are evil and they deserve to be exterminated. And if you don't, you won't live side by side but separate. They will contaminate you. And God did not want his people contaminated by the Canaanites, by their sin. Okay. Doing all right here. Verse 21, "Then Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their cities." Verse 22, "There were no Anakim left in the land of the sons of Israel. Only in Gaza and Gath and in Ashdod some remained. So Joshua took the whole land, according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their divisions by their tribes. And thus the land had rest from war." Okay. So we are going to spend just a little bit of time here on these folks referred to as Anakim. Who were they? And I gave you these references on the back of your handout. If you feel like jotting something in there that summarizes this, you can. Numbers 13:33 tells us that the sons of Anak, that's what Anakim is. The eem on the end is a plural, like in English you would say Anaks. They were Anaks, Anakim, descendants of Anak. And Numbers 13 tells us that they were part of the Nephilim. So there's a larger group called the Nephilim, and a subset of that are the Anakim. Deuteronomy chapter 2 tells us regarding the land of Moab, so this is on the other side of the Jordan, the Emim lived there formerly. a people as great, numerous, and tall as the Anakim. Like the Anakim, they are also regarded as Rephaim, but the Moabites call them Emim. So everybody has a little different name for these people. A couple things I would point out here. One is that they are considered to be tall. How tall is not stated, but that's something that stands out enough about them that it's noteworthy. These are tall people. They are regarded as Rephaim. So Anakim, Rephaim, Moabites call them Emim. Numbers 13, Nephilim. These are all similar groups, subsets within a larger group or that kind of thing, but they're all similar to each other. A little later on in Deuteronomy 2, and this is regarding the land of Ammon rather than Moab. It's also regarded as the land of the Rephaim, for Rephaim formerly lived in it, but the Ammonites called them Zamzumim. There's a tongue twister for you. Zamzumim. That could be some good Bible trivia. Who are the Zamzumim? A people as great, numerous, and tall as the Anakim. But the Lord destroyed them before them, the Israelites, and they dispossessed them and settled in their place. So again, we have this connection between Rephaim, the locals called them Zamzumim, and they're as numerous and great and as tall as the Anakim. This is the second time we've had a different group that's compared to the Anakim. So that makes me think the Anakim must have been kind of a standout even within this group. And they're all described as great, which probably means large, and specifically tall. Deuteronomy 9, Hear, O Israel, you're crossing over into the Jordan today to go in to dispossess nations greater and mightier than you. Great cities fortified to heaven. A people great and tall, the sons of the Anakim, whom you know and whom you have heard it said, who can stand before the sons of Anak? This make you think of the 12 spies that went in to spy out the land and said, we felt like grasshoppers. Apparently, there were some really large people living there, and we know that their cities were well fortified and that there were a lot of these people. Joshua 15, so that's coming up for us in our study of this book. He gave to Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, a portion among the sons of Judah, according to the command of the Lord to Joshua, namely Kiriath Arba. Arba being the father of Anak, that is, Hebron. So the city of Hebron used to be called Kiriath Arba, and Arba was the father of Anak. Anak was the guy that sired the Anakim. They were named after him. Caleb drove them out from there, the three sons of Anak, Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, the children of Anak. So apparently there were three guys, or three, what would I call them, a group of descendants of these three guys that were really impressive and known by name to the Israelites. And Caleb drove them out. Again, a connection here with Hebron. Deuteronomy 3:11. Only Og, the king of Bashan, was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. You recognize that name Rephaim by now. Behold, his bedstead was an iron bedstead. It's in Rabbah of the sons of Ammon. Its length was 9 cubits, and its width 4 cubits by ordinary cubit. Wonder what size that was. Well, you know what a cubit is, right? About 18 inches. Are you doing the math? How big was his bed? About 13 and a half by about 6 feet. Oh, that is a big bed. That's the size of his bed. So who uses a bed that size? Yeah, that's pretty tall and not super wide. I got a cousin that's, is he 6'5", 6'4", Lee? I remember when I was a kid, we'd go spend the summer with him, and he just had a regular twin bed that he slept on since he was a kid. And his feet always hung off the end of it. And right? You know what that's like. Well, it sounds like some guy, namely Og, came up with a solution for himself. And it was a big bed, and that tells you he was a big fella. This is also interesting because, so Og was one of the two guys that was killed by the Israelites. No, that's not the map. I think I've got that next time. Up in the north on Transjordan side. Even after he was killed and his territory taken by Israel, his iron bedstead remained. And the guy says, it's in Rabbah of the sons of Ammon. Like it's a museum artifact. You can go see it today. Yeah. It's like, wow, that is quite the bed, right? I mean, it was notable in that day, and even made it into Scripture, which is kind of interesting. Take note, though, he was one of the remnant of the Rephaim. So I think it tells us, I mean, here's an example of somebody that was part of the Rephaim who were like the Anakim that Joshua kicked out. 1 Chronicles 20, and this is in the days of David. Again, there was war at Gath. There was a man of great stature who had 24 fingers and toes, 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. He also was descended from the Giants, and actually the word there is Rephaim. I'm not sure why my New American Standard substituted the word giants and not in other places, but when he taunted Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shimeah, David's brother, killed him. These were descended from the Rephaim, and again, my New American Standard there for some reason translates giants, in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. So these very large people survived even down into the days of David. Now, that's 400 years after the time of Joshua. So there was a strain of them, much reduced in number, but there was a strain that continued for centuries. And in fact, our text here tells us that they moved out onto the coast in what became Philistine territory. Was Goliath a little giant by comparison? And I don't know. I mean, the text gives us the dimensions of his bed. It doesn't say exactly how tall he was. You would assume there's correlation. But yeah, I mean, that's definitely taller than what Goliath is described as. Yeah, no, I couldn't argue that. It does seem like a genetic anomaly. There's a name for that. Something dactyl. Polydactyl. You can go Google 6-fingered hand and see X-rays of modern people with an extra finger. I mean, it's not unheard of. Hmm. Uh-huh. Not uncommon. Uh-huh. Oh wow. Oh wow. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah, that would be, your whole balance would be thrown off by the removal of something like that. Uh-huh. Okay. So then the text tells us that he kicked them out of the hill country, and he specifically names Hebron, Debir, and Anab. And there were only some left in Gaza, Ashdod, and Gath. And so you can see those highlighted on this map. Out of the hill country, down onto the coastal plain. Just a moment for chronology. We are around roughly 1400 BC. The Philistines, like the Sea People Philistines, arrive in about 1200 and apparently intermarried with these Anakim, Rephaim, whoever, which eventually produced a guy like Goliath. Goliath, of course, was from the city of Gath. I can't help but throw up, and you've seen this before, picture some of the mammoth city wall stonework at Hebron, and the little guy standing there in case you need help picking him out. It's not hard to imagine really large guys moving stones that are so huge. It's not that it would not be possible for an average-sized human, but it's just like, oh, there were really big guys living here, and some really big stonework too. They kind of seem to go together. I know not all really tall people are super strong, but these seemed to have been. I think I'm going to pass by those photos. I'll show you this one, though. It's a potsherd from Gath. This is what it looks like without the highlighting of the letters. It's a little more difficult to see. But it has a name on it that linguistically is quite similar to the name Goliath. And it's from about the time of David, about the time of the biblical Goliath. It may not be a reference to him specifically. Could be a relative or family name. I mean, theoretically, it could just be coincidence too. But kind of interesting to find a name like Goliath at the location of Gath from that time period. It's not written in super large letters, though, like the giant pencil that most of us can't even get a grip on, you know. Okay. Yeah. We need to make a big pencil for this fella. Okay. Yeah, right. Folks will never figure that out. Why is your name carved into the barn door, Steve? Are these giants the descendants of the Son of God? So the same name, Nephilim, is used in Genesis 6 for the descendants talked about there. The only people, however, that made it through the flood were Abraham and his wife and his boys and their daughters. Clearly, some genetic code made it through with them, capable of producing guys like this. But then so did genetic code that produced pygmies. So, there's a lot of potential variation even within just our little group here. If you bred us over enough generations, you could get some people that were very different than what we look like just based on how you combined our genes. And they had a lot better genetic makeup than us. So to answer your question more directly, I would say there's not a direct link because none of those guys made it through the flood. But I do think there's probably similarity. I mean, why use the same name? I would kind of infer from that the Nephilim in Genesis 6 were also very large people. In fact, to be honest with you, that's what this little picture on the back of your handout was originally drawn to represent, was Nephilim back in the days of Genesis 6. It's an artist's conception, but I kind of like it because it's a really big guy that's going a little bit crazy in a realistic-looking setting. It's not cartoony or whatever, so it's a great question. I don't think I can answer it much better than that. Sleep on the floor, buddy. Do you have a question, Dale? No? Okay. Quickly then, some things to think about. The large number and size of the Canaanites did not save them. God was on the side of the Israelites, and it didn't matter if there were giants living in the land. God provided for the Israelites and gave them the land. God delivered the entire land to Israel in a relatively short time. I would probably think of that in terms of a couple of decades, but in the broader scheme of things, that's a pretty short amount of time, and He gave them the entire land. And last but not least, part of God's purpose was to purify the land. I think that's worth thinking about. He wanted His people to remain pure, and one of the ways to do that was for them not to associate, intermarry, mingle socially with evil people. And so we'll come back to that some next week too. But okay, before the kids break down the door, I'm going to close us in a word of prayer. Lord, thank you so much for your word. It's fun to see how you, bit by bit, are handing over the promised land to your people. And it's fun to see how you provide for them and give them what you have promised, even despite the fact that it looks humanly impossible. But it's a piece of cake for you. And we know that you care for us as well and are just as capable in our day as you were in theirs. Help us to rely on that. Help us to be obedient to you. And we ask for your blessing on our weakness and pray that you would strengthen us in our faith and our resolve to obey you. In your name I pray. Amen.